morning, everybody. Thank you all for making the trip over here today. Our topic, as you know, is preventing North Korea's nuclear breakout. This is a problem that goes back a long time. Rob and I were actually in graduate school together in London in the early 1980s. I don't think we were quite worried about North Korea's nuclear breakout when we sat in the bar at the Beavers at the London School of Economics. But it's been almost that long. North Korea has had a nuclear ambition in one way or another for decades, and the U.S. and the international community have so far been partially successful in slowing its progress, but not successful in stopping its progress. As you know, we hit a crossroads in this process roughly a decade ago when, on the one hand, the United States and many international partners grew tired of buying the same pony, which is to say North Korea had largely used its nuclear and missile program to that point as a source of extracting political and economic goods from the international system by agreeing to freeze the program in exchange for something. And roughly a decade ago, the United States and others grew tired of this game and saw it as unproductive because it was only delaying certain results, not preventing them. And at the same time, it appears that the North strategy shifted into away from bargaining and into actually developing and fielding the capabilities. And there has been an intense discussion about whether there is, in fact, still a political moment of opportunity for some sort of agreement that would cause them to stop short and potentially reverse aspects of their program, or whether we need to resort to alternative means to try to prevent militarization in the nuclear domain, or whether we're simply going to have to accept, contain, and deter. And these questions have, of course, come to the fore at this moment with the arrival of a new administration and also with the expectation of significant additional action by North Korea within the next few days to further develop its nuclear posture. Rob Litwak joins us to talk about a brand new monograph that he's put out on this topic. Happy to make this available to people to look at. It's available online for downloading. Rob is just the right person to speak to us today and to write on this topic. He is, you've seen his bio in the announcement, he's the Vice President for Scholars and Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Some of you may know this is an important think tank in Washington created to memorialize the work of Woodrow Wilson through scholarship. And on the target list of potential institutions to be axed in the current budget environment. Rob served on the National Security Council staff, but most importantly, he's made a mark intellectually in his career in thinking about and publishing on the challenges posed by regional actors seeking nuclear weapons, and has quarreled with the term rogue states, a term that the Obama administration didn't use, but has come back into vogue, or at least come back into usage with the current administration, rogue regimes. But Rob has written about the problem of Iran and nuclear weapons, Iraq and nuclear weapons, and now North Korea and nuclear weapons. So he sees across the problem set, not just deep into one particular country of interest. So Rob's going to speak on the record for 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll have Q&A. Again, this will be on the record, so please wait for the microphone to come to you, and you might be mindful of the things that will be carried on YouTube that you might say from the floor. With that, please join me in welcoming Rob Litwak.
Thank you, Brad. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Brad, for that introduction. Thanks to Zach Davis as well for organizing my visit to the Center for Global Security Research. And I really commend you all here for the excellent work being done here at the center and its contribution to our public policy debate. As Brad mentioned, I come from the Wilson Center. It's a presidential memorial. It's federally funded. We also raise private funds. Our mothership is the Smithsonian Institution for unique institutional reasons. The founder was Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And Moynihan said famously that how you think about the world affects how you act in the world. And Brad alluded to the fact that the Wilson Center's budget has come into question in the current environment. And what is the value proposition, to use the private sector term, for the Wilson Center? We receive $10.5 million. I would argue that the value proposition, going back to Moynihan's maxim, is how you think about the world affects how you act in the world. That our inadequate conceptualization of the problem, faulty threshold assumptions that drive policy options, can have trillion-dollar consequences. So in Washington, should there be an institution like the Wilson Center, which is truly nonpartisan, that contributes to the policy debate by unpacking these assumptions that can have these downstream consequences? Take an assumption like Sunni and Shia will get along in a post-Saddam Iraq. This form of policy hygiene is essential if we're going to have sound public policy. And that's the role of the Wilson Center. The publication that I'll speak about today reflects that mission. I attempt to do a form of policy hygiene, going through and unpacking assumptions and the policy kind of ramifications of different assumptions and the downstream consequences. I'm in this field. I'm a citizen, so I have a view of what would be the most efficacious approach given where we're at now. In my publication, I identify an analytical option that should be put to the test, in my view. And that analytical option is that there is political space to achieve a freeze agreement with North Korea. And I'll lay out some of the conditions for that during the course of my talk. It's not an overstatement to say that the risk of a second Korean War has never been greater. The United States is deploying an additional carrier to the Korean waters. There's discussion in the press of a widely expected nuclear test by North Korea. We are in what I would call a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis. People said when Trump came to office that his first test would be in North Korea. We are in that crisis now, but it is playing out, not in 13 days as in October 1962, but in a longer time frame. But there's still urgency to it. The precipitant of the crisis is that North Korea is now on the verge of a nuclear breakout. And that breakout is both quantitative, as North Korea ramps up its numbers of nuclear weapons, and is qualitative, as it pursues miniaturization of warheads and long-range ballistic missiles. The public source projections are that North Korea by 2020 could have an arsenal at the high-end projections of 100 nuclear warheads. Its tempo of testing has increased. 2 nuclear tests last year, 25 ballistic missile tests. And within several years, North Korea could plausibly mount a miniaturized warhead on an ICBM and strike the US homeland. And that would be a game changer. Brad alluded to our graduate school days. When I got into this field, I could not have imagined that North Korea would possess a nuclear arsenal approaching 1/2 the size of Great Britain's. And juxtapose that arsenal size to the North Korean economy. According to the CIA, it's $50 billion. If you look in listings of economic activity in this country, that's the size of Dayton, Ohio. So a country with a nuclear arsenal approaching 1/2 the size of Great Britain's, potentially by 2020, has an economy the size of Dayton, Ohio. You've seen the night visual photos of the Korean Peninsula. South Korea lit up. North Korea essentially blacked out, with the exception of the dot in Pyongyang. A grotesque social science experiment is being played out. As a society that feeds its people 1,500 calories a day is living next door to a society where average caloric intake is 3,000 calories a day or 2,500 calories a day. There are now physical differences between North and South Koreans. The typical South Korean boy is several centimeters at age 10, several centimeters shorter than his South Korean counterpart. North Korea is a failed state with nuclear weapons. And it is ruled by a dynastic cult, the Kim family. And that's the dilemma. The nuclear issue is embedded in the broader question of North Korea's societal evolution. But these timelines are not in sync. The nuclear timeline is urgent and immediate, and the regime change timeline is uncertain. We can't wait for an indeterminate regime change process to play out while the Kim family acquires this potential breakout capacity. Nor can we base US policy on the assumption or vain hope of regime collapse. That assumption is run through a lot of our analyses. And when, my starting point was threshold assumptions drive policy outcomes. If your threshold assumption is the North Korean regime is about to collapse, and I'll develop this point of how threat is linked to the character of the regime, then problem solved. It's not the capability, it's the capability in the hands of this adversarial proliferator that's the problem. But we can't base our policy on the assumption of regime collapse because this regime is perverse, as proven at times, like hyper-stable. I mean, they went through a famine in the 1990s, 1 to 2 million deaths. They're feeding their population 1,500 calories a day, and yet through coercive means, political mobilization, they are able to hang in there. There'd been this metaphor of analogizing North Korea to a plane, soft landing, hard landing. Someone offered the third alternative. Well, maybe the plane's not crashing, or it's not crashing on a timeline that we can know, such that we can premise our nuclear policies vis-a-vis North Korea on the basis that the regime is going to collapse. I'll circle back to that theme. So what are the options? President Trump has tweeted, "It won't happen," when referring to the breakout. In his recent visit with the summit with the Chinese president, he said that in the lead up to it, he said, "We'll solve the North Korean problem either with the Chinese or without the Chinese support." What does that mean in practice? Now, last Sunday, and Brad alluded to this, the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, referred to North Korea as a rogue regime. This was a departure from the Obama administration, which had called North Korea an outlier state. And the term outlier actually was used by President Obama during an interview about the nuclear posture review, in which the person who introduced me today played such a central role in 2010. And I seized on that as a theme of a book that came out in 2012. Nomenclature matters, but it's not out of some fetishism or preoccupation with language. It's back to my starting point, that the assumptions and the policies that undergird these different terms. And I'd like to unpack that a bit in the lead up to my discussion of the current crisis with North Korea. The term rogue state entered the US foreign policy lexicon after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and after the first hot war in the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein was the archetype rogue state, rogue leader. And he met the two key definitional criteria. He was pursuing WMD programs, and Saddam Hussein employed terrorism as an instrument of state policy. Those were the two key defining criteria. President Clinton said that rogue states constituted a distinct category of state in the international system. Now, this wasn't an academic sort of creating a neologism that he could debate with other people in the field. This was the President of the United States asserting that rogue states constituted a distinct category of states in the international system. So when I returned, I was on the NSC staff on a detail from the Wilson Center. I went back to the Wilson Center and I wrote a book kind of consistent with the mission. How do you think about the world? I traced where did the term rogue state come from? How did it get translated into policy? What were the contradictions related to, that followed on from the term as it got translated into strategy? And I laid out a critique in a book that focused on the obvious. I mean, the core group of rogue states were Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and Libya. But the term rogue state was a US political concept without standing in international law. And it was applied selectively. In the 1990s, Cuba was called a rogue state, even though it didn't meet the definitional criteria, while Syria, which did meet the criteria with chemical weapons and use of terrorism as an instrument of state policy, was omitted from the list of rogue states because in the 90s, the then Clinton administration needed Syria in the Middle East peace talks. So it was applied selectively. But the key limitation of the rogue state approach, as the term was translated into strategy and policies, was that it precluded meaningful policy differentiation. That once a state was called a rogue state, it was typecasting of sorts. It essentially meant that the state was beyond the pale and not a candidate for traditional diplomacy. And it pushed into kind of a one-size-fits-all approach of like hard isolation and hard containment. If efforts to engage rogue states was held by hardliners to be tantamount to appeasement, and why not? These were rogue states, they're beyond the pale. But the concept ran up against hard realities. First in North Korea, during the first North Korean nuclear crisis in 1993-94, when the Clinton administration wanted to engage North Korea about its mature nuclear program. And second, in 1997, when a reformist president came to power in Iran, and the Clinton administration wanted to explore the possibilities of this new reformist president, President Khatami, and whether there was an opening there. So that the term became a political straitjacket that precluded differentiation. And the Clinton administration jettisoned the term in favor of the infelicitous phrase, states of concern. And I have a psychiatrist friend who tells me we're all perpetually in states of concern, but it was, the Bush administration came to office in 2001 and revived the term. I was part of the ABC, anything but Clinton approach. They revived the term, but it really went into hyperdrive after 9/11 and became central to strategy. 9/11 didn't change the international order, but it did lead to a profound redefinition of threat focused on the nexus of proliferation and terrorism, these two defining criteria of rogue state status. And the argument went that the threat posed by the rogue states derived from the character of their regimes. So the behavior change wouldn't get you there, because the bad and threatening behavior derived from the character of the regime. So if you wanted to turn off the threatening behavior, you had to change the regime. This argumentation was central to the case for preventive war in Iraq to address that nonproliferation concern. In 2003, two contrasting nonproliferation precedents were set. In Iraq, after the invasion and toppling of Saddam Hussein, it was an example of nonproliferation through a change of regime. Excuse me. What a friend of mine called uncooperative threat reduction. In Libya, 8 months after the fall of Baghdad, an alternative precedent was set with the deal that surprised us that morning in December 2003 from Tripoli, London, and Washington. That Gaddafi had agreed to verifiably dismantle that country's unconventional weapons programs. The Bush administration claimed the Libya breakthrough as a dividend of the Iraq War, that Gaddafi had been scared straight. And no doubt, the takedown of the Saddam Hussein regime certainly was taken on board by the Gaddafi regime. It's hard to say exactly how they read it, as it was, as with all these hard cases, it's an opaque regime, hard to know what the motivation is. But if one thinks of it logically, him giving up his WMD capabilities, the crux of the deal was a tacit but clear security assurance that if Gaddafi gave up his weapons of mass destruction, that the United States would fall off of the objective of hard regime change as was pursued in Iraq. Logically, if Gaddafi had believed the United States was hell-bent on regime change in Libya, regardless of his actions, Gaddafi, who had a pretty rudimentary WMD program, as it later turned out, would have been, his motivation would have been to hit the gas on those programs, not to have given them up. So a tacit but clear security assurance was central to the achievement of the Libyan deal. The second Bush administration was trapped between precedents, between these Iraq and Libya precedents. It couldn't replicate the Iraq model. No one, certainly once the insurgency started in Iraq, no one was up for another invasion and occupation of a country. And the Bush administration was unwilling to offer Iran and North Korea the full Libya deal, in a sense, with the security assurance. The second Bush administration made efforts with North Korea through six-party talks and with Iran through the EU3 process to which we were associated to address the nonproliferation challenges with North Korea and Iran. But it never really overcame, the Bush administration never really overcame the legacy of the first Bush administration and the whole emphasis in that first Bush administration on regime change as a priority. And in the second administration, there was a consistently mixed message of whether the U.S. objective toward Iran and North Korea, these hard case states, whether the objective was behavior change or regime change. And when the objective was not clear, the United States was not able to achieve either in these cases. We didn't get behavior change and we didn't get regime change. President Obama came to office having campaigned on the controversial platform of engaging adversarial states. In fact, he gave that speech at the Wilson Center to reach out. And he was condemned, criticized both by his Democratic, the other contender, Hillary Clinton. He was criticized by the Republican candidate, John McCain. When he won the presidency, assumed office, he, if I can use the word, he rebooted U.S. policy toward the rogue states. He dropped the term rogue state, this unilateral American political concept, and he used the term outlier. He framed the challenge posed by these states not in terms of a unilateral American concept, but rather in terms of conduct by North Korea and Iran that violated international norms, established international norms. And the administration clarified the mixed message from the Bush administration, making clear that they would take yes for an answer, that if they changed their behavior, the United States would take yes for an answer and would not pursue kind of a regime change strategy. President Obama offered in his inauguration a hand if North Korea and Iran would unclench their fist. And he made clear that the full Libya deal was on the table, that we'd offer the security assurance. And that was part and parcel of this clarification of the mixed message. Then came the Libya regime takedown in 2011 by NATO. And we know that it was done not under a counterproliferation rubric, but it was done under a humanitarian rubric. And that is we could have a fascinating seminar at the Wilson Center on the distinction between kind of humanitarian and counterproliferation interventions. But if you're sitting in Tehran or Pyongyang, this is a distinction without a difference. And it complicated the U.S. ability, maybe even priced us out of the security assurance market with these countries. Iran, then under Ahmadinejad, and North Korea, then going through the dynastic succession from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, rebuffed Obama's metaphoric outstretched hand from his inaugural address. The Obama administration pivoted to a policy of strategic patience with North Korea. The idea being we'd ramp up pressure on North Korea through sanctions, and then they would come back to the table. With Iran, an opening occurred in 2013 with the election of a reformist president, Rouhani. The overall U.S. strategy toward North Korea and Iran was characterized by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as pressure and engagement, a willingness to engage, but the coercive pressure, primarily of economic sanctions, were designed to change the calculus of decision-making in Tehran and Pyongyang. By 2013, that process had come to fruition in Iran to the point that Iran was willing to come to the table to talk about their uranium enrichment program and the conduct they'd engaged in that had been a violation of their NPT kind of obligations. Rouhani was elected on a platform of getting the sanctions lifted. And indeed, economic pressure brought Iran to the table. 18 months of difficult negotiations. Labs played an important role supporting that effort that culminated in the July 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The JCPOA was a deal, not a grand bargain, that the negotiators had made the decision that they were going to focus on the discrete nuclear issue, and the negotiations were not going to encompass other areas of Iranian conduct, like its support for Hezbollah, Yemen, that if we had shot the moon, so to speak, for a grand bargain, we would not have gotten any kind of deal. And the Supreme Leader had designated, from my colleagues who are the Iran watchers, had given Rouhani and Zarif the nuclear portfolio, but Hezbollah, Yemen stays with the Revolutionary Guards, and they were not going to conflate these issues. They were not prepared for a grand bargain for the host of domestic reasons that are known. The JCPOA constrains Iran's capabilities. I mean, it constrains their access to weapons usable material for 15 years, among its other provisions. In the classic public policy dichotomy, the JCPOA was transactional, not transformational. And that relates to the comment I made about North Korea's nuclear program as being that the nuclear issue is embedded in the broader question of societal evolution. The same holds in the case of Iran. And my work is in the comparative proliferation field, and I've worked across cases. The nuclear issue is embedded in this broader question of society, the future of these societies. And that, in short, the nuclear issue is a proxy for a more fundamental debate. It's a proxy. And the more fundamental debate goes back to 9/11 and this persisting debate in the US over whether the US objective toward these rogue states should be to change their conduct, their behavior, or should it be to change the regimes themselves. If you look at kind of the optic on the US Senate debate on the Iran nuclear deal, and they needed to take some steps to implement the agreement. There was this bumper sticker of the better deal. And the Iran nuclear deal is in the area where reasonable people can eminently disagree. This ain't the law of thermodynamics. You're making certain assumptions about the efficacy of the deal, and it's eminently in the domain of reasonable people can disagree. But if one looks at the better deal proponents, people said there's a better deal to be had out there. There wasn't much specificity to what they really were asking for. It wasn't like this deal provides for 5,000 centrifuges, but the better deal would be 4,000 or 3,000, given that 0 was never an option. Because the day that Obama walked into the White House, there were already 9,000 spinning. And so getting to 0 was not a feasible or realistic diplomatic objective. The crux was, for the opponents of the deal, it was essentially they were opposed to any deal with Iran because of the character of the regime. The fact that it was transactional and not transformational, that it just dealt with the nuclear issue, but it didn't stop Iran from helping Hezbollah and meddling in Yemen and doing abusing its own people with this authoritarian state. It didn't address these other concerns. And what proponents of the deal sold as its strong point, hey, this deal buys us 15 years. The critics viewed as its main liability. It only buys 15 years, and at the end of this 15 years, this regime will still be in power, and will have it will be able to ramp up its program again. Again, this speaks to the embedded quality of the nuclear issue and how the nuclear question is a proxy for this persisting post-9/11 debate. Further kind of aspect of the deal. It was sold in transactional terms on both sides. In the United States, it was sold that it buys time, 15 years of constraining their access to weapons usable material, and then other things kick in after that that will be factors that Iran would have to take into account if it elected to break out. On the Iranian side, the deal was sold as this wins us sanctions relief. But underlying this transactional deal was an implicit transformational bet by President Obama. And the implicit transformational bet was this, that in 15 years, Iran might be in a different place. Buy time, allow societal evolution to play out. It's a defensible bet, but it's not a sure thing. Iran's supreme leader is making the flip side of that transformational bet, that the deep state there, and I'm used deep state before it entered our current political lexicon, in the ways that it has, but the intelligence ministry, the Revolutionary Guards, the coercive power of their states will be able to pocket the economic benefits of the deal and insulate the regime from its political consequences. That's the bet that the supreme leader is making, that they can hang in for the 15 years. And we'll see how it'll play out. I would argue, and the reason I developed the point for a few minutes, is that I believe the JCPOA is a relevant precedent that could be applied to the North Korean case. Now with North Korea, strategic patience has essentially led to acquiescence as North Korea continues to build up. And we've been in this diplomatic impasse with North Korea, where North Korea asserts we will only come to the new negotiating table if we are recognized as a nuclear weapon state. The United States says we will never recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. I think this is in the domain, that's why we pay diplomats. I mean, this should be a bridgeable gap to bring the parties to the table. There were other red lines that the Iranians asserted and we asserted, and yet we overcame a number of these red lines to meet in Vienna and reach an agreement. It should not be a showstopper. The current nuclear crisis with Iran is the third in a quarter century. The first was in 93-94 when North Korea was poised to unload its research reactor, separate the plutonium, and gain access to several bombs worth of material. There had been shutdowns between 89 and 91, and the CIA estimated 1 to 2 bombs worth of material might have been separated. The crisis for the Clinton administration was they're going to unload more. The people in this room know a lot more about the technical side of the operating of the reactors and the separation of plutonium process, but that was the inflection point that led to the first the North Korean nuclear crisis, which played out. They looked at the military option. I'll say more about that in a bit. There was a diplomatic breakthrough that was fortuitous. It was timed Jimmy Carter going to North Korea at the time and changing the political dynamic such that by October of 1994, they reached the agreed framework, which was a very short document. It was 3 pages long, I believe. Compare that to the JCPOA, which runs on for the length that it does with 3 annexes. What the agreed framework did was it froze the North Korean plutonium program with an offer of out years, 10, 15 years of providing them with light water reactors that would depend on changes in North Korean conduct. In the 1990s, the late 1990s, as the New York Times reported, A.Q. Khan was bartering centrifuges for ballistic missiles with North Korea, and the HEU route opened up. It was kind of identified in the late 1990s, and by 2002, the Bush administration confronted North Korea on its covert uranium enrichment program. In October 2002, the American Assistant Secretary confronted his North Korean counterpart. Now go back to the point that I made about the embedded quality of the nuclear issue. Concepts of societal change undergird our strategies. And the role of analysts is to unpack what these assumptions are that drive. What are the assumptions about the future of the target state and a host of other assumptions about us and the efficacy of certain actions? How does that affect strategy development? Take the most famous example, the X article that we all read in undergraduate courses. It wasn't called Containment, a new strategy for the Cold War. It was called The Sources of Soviet Conduct. It was a brilliant analysis of Russian and Soviet political culture. Kennan argued that the seeds of the Soviet Union's disintegration lay in that society, and that if the United States adopted essentially a geostrategic holding operation and balanced Soviet power, that these contradictions would play out over time. Fast forward to the late 1980s, Kennan testified before the Senate. It has played out, and Russia, now under Putin, has become, so to speak, an orthodox great power. Authoritarian, not democratic, but a great power, not a revolutionary state the way the Soviet Union had been. Take the debate we've had on Iran, which has so dominated our public space. The bandwidth we've devoted, with reason, to the Iran nuclear program. But what we were talking about with Iran was a latent capability. With North Korea, we're talking a mature capability with an arsenal in the 10 to the mid-teens in the open source estimates. But if you looked at the different bumper stickers, eating your cornflakes, reading a newspaper if you still do, and looking at different op-eds on Iran, bomb, contain, engage. Each of these options is premised on a sense of societal evolution. So those who advocated the military option on Iran, the underlying assumption was the Iranian regime is apocalyptic and undeterrable, and therefore mere acquisition of capabilities is unacceptable. The 2007 NIE on Iran posited that Iran is subject to a cost-benefit analysis. If you think of them as kind of sensitive to costs and benefits versus they're apocalyptic and undeterrable, that leads you into a different kind of analytical route, and it drives toward a different policy prescription. With North Korea in 2002, the Bush administration was motivated, as one senior official put it, by the belief that the North Korean regime was teetering. That was the word used. And it came from the experience in the 1990s with the famines. Now, if you posit that the regime is teetering and that threat is linked to the character of the regime, if the regime goes, problem solved. You don't have to worry about spent fuel rods or a covert HEU program. You will have addressed what is the source of the threat through the regime. And I think that's one of the reasons why they took the stance they did in the 2002 playout, in which the agreed framework was abrogated, calling the North Koreans out on the cheating. Because to confront North Korea on a uranium enrichment program of unknown scope and unknown urgency, the Bush administration walked away from the agreed framework, which had a plutonium program of known scope and known urgency frozen. And I think that there's a contentious sort of narrative about that period, but I think rather than use the agreed framework process to address the uranium enrichment infractions, they jettisoned the agreed framework and the constraints on the plutonium program. And that's where, of course, the initial North Korean arsenal came from. They separated the plutonium, they moved it to kind of undisclosed locations, greatly complicating our ability to understand their capabilities. The North Korean program, up to now, you could characterize it as being determined and incremental. And there's been a certain duality to the program. They've viewed their nuclear weapon as a deterrent, but also as a bargaining chip. They don't have oil, wealth. They engage in illicit activities to raise money. But the emphasis on one or the other has shifted over time. Given the tempo of the testing that they're doing, I think they're moving from a phase where this historic period where it's been determined and incremental to actually bordering on a crash program. I mean, you take 2 nuclear weapons tests, 25 ballistic missile tests. They have this up-tempo that has an urgency behind it. and drives us to the need to address it with the urgency that it's warranted. The North Koreans have been emphasizing, particularly since the Libyan takedown, they said the same after the 50 cruise missiles hit Syria, that they need their nuclear deterrent because of a predatory United States. They've got this arsenal of the size that it is, that you're all aware of, and they're poised to really ramp it up in the next couple of years. Zero is not a realistic or feasible objective with North Korea. We're not going to be able to get them to zero in the near term. And we're in the midst of what I call this third nuclear crisis with North Korea. So within that context, what are the options? Basically, there are three: bomb, negotiate, or acquiesce. Each has its own constraints and downside. Now, the military option is much discussed as being on the table. And now it's discussed in terms of a limited strike on North Korea, like the launch pad where they're teeing up a ballistic missile test, those types of scenarios. The military option has been discussed since the first North Korean nuclear crisis. And at that time, with one main site in Yangbyon, there was, and Secretary Perry has written about it, confidence that they could accomplish that and mitigate some of the collateral effect, damage effects of a strike on a nuclear facility. But the showstopper has been the catalytic consequences of a strike, that it would escalate to a general war on the Korean Peninsula. I worked on the National Security Council staff. If you're writing the decision memo for the president and one of your cons is, could lead to general war on Korean Peninsula, that is a non-trivial con. And at the time, General Luck, the commander in South Korea, said a war on the peninsula, he said, $1 million, $1 trillion. 1 million casualties, $1 trillion. Use the inflation index from 1994 to now. It would be even worse, particularly since they have their own small arsenal and the functional equivalent of a nuclear weapon in forward-based artillery pointed at Seoul, which is dangerously close to the DMZ. So the military option is fraught with problems. Hardline critics continue to view diplomacy with North Korea as tantamount to appeasing a rogue regime. And squeezing North Korea has not been possible up to now because the Chinese won't cooperate with a strategy they view as running the risk of regime collapse, and they lose their buffer, et cetera. So with North Korea already possessing a nuclear arsenal in the 10 to mid-teens range, there is no good option. What then is the least bad alternative? When the United States can't bomb and it won't negotiate, it is in fact acquiescing to a continued North Korean buildup. And as a card-carrying utilitarian, the decision matrix box I get craziest in terms of just reaction is that we end up acquiescing to a buildup because we can't, because the constraints on the military option pertain, and we have difficulty either on our side or in terms of engaging North Korea in meaningfully negotiating. We end up essentially acquiescing to their buildup. So in preventing North Korea's nuclear breakout, available at the popular price of free on the internet machine, as John McCain calls it, you can read my publication, and I argue that the political space may exist for a pivot to serious diplomacy through what I call coercive engagement. Though a full rollback of North Korea's nuclear program is not a realistic goal, transactional diplomacy on the model of the Iran nuclear deal could potentially freeze North Korea's capabilities at their current level. That may be attainable. This would make the best of a bad situation. When 0 warheads is not on the table, an agreement capping North Korea at 20 nuclear weapons is better than an unconstrained program that hits 100 by 2020. And a freeze, and it's been spelled out, Sig Hecker's got his 3 no's. I mean, there's been a lot of work done on what would a freeze constitute. A freeze would preclude the additional testing that North Korea still needs to master miniaturization and reliable long-range missiles. So let me kind of come to a conclusion here and make the pitch for coercive engagement. Why should diplomacy succeed this time when it has failed in the past? That's a fair question. I'd argue that this analytical option has political possibilities because of the China factor, and that a North Korean breakout would be a game changer for the United States, but it would also be a game changer for China because they would then face the adverse consequences of a region in which North Korea has 100 nuclear weapons. The THAAD deployment is just a down payment. They in Beijing could not preclude the possibility that South Korea and even Japan would reassess their non-nuclear status and their pressures on both of Japan in particular that go beyond just the North Korean threat related to what China's doing that are creating pressures there, notwithstanding the political culture there and the constitutional constraints. In the meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi, there was much discussion of the North Korean case and a sense that there is political space for China and the United States to work together. Now, up to now, China has enforced sanctions lackadaisically. We read in today's Washington Post that they've provided critical components that the North Korean ballistic missile program needs. They've turned a blind eye to it. And their talking point has been, this is an American problem. You had a war with North Korea, and you have an armistice. You don't have a peace treaty. It's your problem, not our problem. That's been their talking point up to now. But with North Korea on the verge of a breakout, this problem could become their problem because they'll have to deal with the adverse strategic consequences in their region of North Korea, which has achieved a breakout. Transactional diplomacy would decouple the nuclear issue from the question of regime change. I talked about the relationship between the nuclear question and the regime, the societal evolution, regime change timelines. We have to, as sort of a practical matter, decouple them because when we talk about regime change, we've lost China. And let me just develop that point in closing. What I see as the analytical option is that there is a point of near-term optimization among the parties. For North Korea, a freeze would permit Pyongyang to retain a minimum deterrent and the Kim family. Wouldn't get them to zero, to maintain a minimum deterrent, keep the regime in power. For China, it would preserve a strategic buffer, North Korea, and avert the adverse strategic consequences that I alluded to. And for the United States, an interim agreement freezing North Korean capabilities would prevent the breakout. And our narrative of the negotiations and the freeze would be that this is an interim step toward the long-term denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. My new study argues sort of this exercise in policy hygiene. My study argues that this analytical option should be put to the diplomatic test. Otherwise, we are left with the bad options of bombing or acquiescing. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to address any questions.
We'd like to get us started, so let me pass the mic to you, and someone else is going to do microphone duty, I think, but can you pass this on down the road?
Hi, thank you very much. Brent Blue, Lawrence Livermore. North Korea is such a small area. Technically, in theory, we could let them propagate, go on their own, but surround them with a robust missile defense and sort of take away their capabilities. And maybe your coercive argument might, with that such buildup, might actually be directed towards China to push them into an area where they're uncomfortable with the buildup of our forces in that area, that they might then turn and really, it's shifted their calculus to that North Korea's gone too far. So I don't know whether, I think I was expecting maybe a little bit more on the China side in our ability to maybe squeeze them in their coercive argument.
I think the Chinese are now kind of motivated to, I mean, they see the consequences of breakout. They probably overstate the strategic consequences for them of like THAAD deployment to the region in terms of degrading their deterrent. But if in a world where North Korea has an arsenal of the size that would projected through this breakout, we'd have to, you know, Brad alluded to it. You know, what would it mean to say, well, we can't bomb and we can't constrain the program, so we're going to have to think about living with this nuclear outlier and adapting a policy of containment and deterrence. We would pursue both variants of deterrence. There would be a declaratory policy emphasizing punishment, and it would mean not only in terms of regional aggression, but also in terms of, since North Korea is the state that will sell anything to anyone, the transfer to non-state actors is a big concern with North Korea. So there'd be a robust kind of declaratory policy to deter that, but also there would be deterrence by denial through a host of measures, ballistic missile defense, and what David Sanger has written about in the New York Times about cyber as an instrument that would be used. But that, I think, is an option that's less preferable than constraining the program.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I think that the Chinese are hyperventilating a bit about THAAD and in terms of degrading. I mean, there are people here who have kind of the technical kind of assessment and of ballistic missile defense and the size of that system and vis-a-vis the Chinese deterrent force. And when they say this is degrading our deterrent, I think that kind of rings hollow.
So part of that deal then, if you just sketch the outlines of a half a loaf deal, but one part of that is we are living in a deterrent, a classical deterrent relationship with one of your rogue outlier, you know, crazy states. And, you know, in the history of deterrence, you can look back and ask if Mao or Stalin or Khrushchev or any of these characters with which we built the modern construct of nuclear deterrence, really, were they really on the same page with us? But are you then saying that that is a stable and reasonable place for the United States to be with respect to this Kim dynasty?
I mean, you know, a guy who is the dynastic successor who, you know, whacks his brother, Godfather 2 style, in Kuala Lumpur with VX, and I mean, hey, what could go wrong, right? You know, so I think, you know, in the classic kind of technique of the speaker when addressed with a hard question, throw it back at everyone and say, I think this is a ripe area, Brad, for research by the Center for Global Security Research of like deterrent requirements of North Korea at different levels, you know, of capability. There's been, just to unpack kind of the question a bit, there have been, you know, one of the connotation of rogue state and rogue regime is essentially crazy state. There's a book by Yehezkel Dror called Crazy State. And at the Wilson Center, we have a fantastic Cold War International History project, which has gotten archives from the former Eastern Bloc, conversations between Kim Il-sung and Honecker and North Korean diplomats. These are documents they never dreamt would see the light of day. And we're able to glean some conclusions from them with a recognition that history doesn't, quote unquote, prove anything. But the North Koreans have commented that, noticed that the United States does not respond to their provocations, that they can seize the Pueblo or shoot down an EC-121, and we don't respond because of this kind of overriding concern with the catalytic, you know, war consequences of getting engaged militarily with them. And so there is a rationality at work, but how do we understand what the inner logic is of sorts? This current leader has gone like full Caligula, in terms of purging members of his family and deep purges into the military, beyond what his father and the founding father, Kim Il-sung did. And I think as one looks at different, what are the different pathways of societal change in North Korea, you see, there's sort of three options out there. There's, in a book I did in 2012 called Outlier States, which there was a chapter on what are the pathways in from the cold for these states. I had a section in there on pathways, and you have external intervention for regime change, like when Tanzania goes into Uganda and overthrows Idi Amin, or Vietnam goes into Cambodia and overthrows Pol Pot. But the international system is hardwired against, on the principle of sovereignty of one state doing it to another state. So that option also can lead to war, has huge costs. So the external intervention route, like why couldn't China just take care of this problem, is out there. The second route is, could North Korea go through an internal evolution? Look at how South Africa, ended apartheid and evolved into a different kind of state. With Iran, actually, because there are real politics that go on there, you see some tantalizing possibilities of the revolution moderating over time. There's plenty to bet against that option, but you see at least the possibility. With North Korea, opaque society, this juxtaposition of big nuclear weapons arsenal and a minuscule economy, and this dynastic cult. And when Ceausescu visited North Korea and he went back to Romania to start his own cult, or to really put into hyperdrive, he envied Saddam Hussein and Ceausescu. They envied the cult of personality that North Korea had. And I think that the Ceausescu model could happen. We can't bank on it, but it would be sudden collapse. When you have in North Korea, they call it the court economy. Social scientists call it the court economy. The million or so people that the Kim family needs to keep in Remy and Mercedes and Toro from Tokyo, to keep them happy, to keep the regime in power. And it costs in the $1 to $2 billion a year range to do that, and they raise the money through illicit activities. But you could see the possibility that could the military flip on the family, or could other elements of the security services do that? And that's what happened with Ceausescu. It's not something a social scientist could have predicted, but it was sudden kind of regime change from within. So if I had to bet, that would be the pathway of change in North Korea. But it's not something we can bet on, and certainly we can't premise the policy. Gentleman's shaking his head. I think it's a long shot. I'm not. But it's an opaque society. It's hard to say. Do you have a view on that, or?
No, I don't think this could happen, because this is the nation of the country, the brain of the people.
Fair point. Yeah.
I'll take the bait you threw on the table. And in fact, about 3 months ago, we had a session here on deterring a nuclear arming in North Korea, a 2-day workshop. And of course, in thinking through that problem set, we face a couple of challenges. One is that in building a stronger deterrence architecture in Northeast Asia, it immediately, for the Japanese, it becomes complicated. Is this a deterrence architecture that's about North Korea or about China? Well, it's about both, but in different ways. And this attaches to the second problem, which is that to get anywhere in strengthening regional deterrence, we need the Japanese and South Koreans to cooperate, both with each other and with us, a trilateral strengthening of deterrence in the region. And this butts up against your core question, which is to gain sustained long-term political support in all of our countries, all three. There's a political demand for a credible political strategy that holds some credible possibility of solving the problem in the long term, because our publics don't want to face the prospect of decades of containment under the North Korean nuclear threat to any of the three of us. They want some prospect that there's an escape of some kind. And I'm wondering how you assess if you've had reactions from experts in Seoul and Tokyo to the set of arguments you've set out in this paper, contemporary reactions, do they share the perception of the three options and their weaknesses, and do they lean in the direction you've indicated, or do they lean in a different direction?
I'll find out in May. I'm going out there to do book talks in both Seoul and Tokyo. Look, recall that like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, like the United States reaction was, this is an unacceptable threat, that the United States, would have this nuclear threat on our periphery. And the European reaction was like, we've lived under this threat all the time, So for Japan and South Korea, North Korea's already achieved the breakout. Arguably, from our perspective, they've achieved a breakout, that they've got a minimum deterrent. It's really that they're about to ramp up to like a really, kind of large, an arsenal approaching that of a major power that gives urgency to the current question. So from their perspective, they're already living under a kind of a North Korean kind of nuclear shadow. And we have to go to our traditional playbook, and you've written a lot about this, Brad, of deterrence and reassurance. And deterring, go back to the classic deterrence theory, that deterring an adversary is easier than reassuring an ally, okay? Reassuring an adversary is harder still. And when the United States does training with South Korea, I did an article in Survival when this kind of goes to the question about preemption and preventive use of force, and how it relates to deterrence. That debate, that was post 9/11 debate, when there was sort of an uptick of interest in preemptive use of force, is that kind of what looks like, reassurance from our side to an ally looks like, you're teeing up a preventive strike from the perspective of North Korea. North Korea, the leader, Kim Jong-il, disappeared for a month during the Iraq War, given the kind of regime change rhetoric coming out of Washington. And South Korean and U.S. forces have practiced decapitation. So, this deterrence conundrum of, you want to demonstrate a capability, but the adversary may think that it's the precursor, to doing it. I mean, look, the kind of the Able Archer, debate from 1983. We practice it; they think we're about to do it. So I think in a context where North Korea is really could miscalculate, we just have to be careful in kind of our messaging, to them. And I don't have good answers on the kind of the South Korean and Japanese thing, other than kind of the obvious point, which I stated at the top of my answer to you, which is, for them, they feel they've already been living under this, and they've had taepodongs overflying Honshu, and I think they did that in '98, right? They overflew Honshu, and they've been doing, the medium range tests, and the open source literature claims, asserts that they've reached a degree of success with miniaturization, that they could actually put something on an intermediate range missile, so they're facing it right now. I think they would have a shared interest in us in preventing them getting much larger, because once we start doing the much larger mission, and this is really kind of like, I'm at the edge of my brief here, this is really where someone here it's a ripe topic to take on, of like, what happens when we go from deterring a minimum deterrent North Korea to one that's much larger, and then the Venn diagrams or whatever start intersecting, that it starts looking like you're really addressing a Chinese system, and the Japanese may say, we're really doing this about North Korea, but between us, we're also doing it about kind of trying to mitigate the Chinese threat. It's a really kind of a complicated, a complex calculus there, and it really needs to be unpacked. I think that's sort of a ripe target out there. I have a page. You can do these talks. Do you have a question? You do these talks and you sort of look at your watch and say, do I have time to get this in? I do have a page I didn't deliver in my remarks, and I think it's important, so let me just throw it into. I will ask Rob, what is the question you wanted to ask that you didn't have in your talk? Okay, here's my answer to that question. There are two. I've talked about the upside of the freeze agreement. Okay, what are the downsides? From our perspective, what is the downside of the deal? I think there are two. First, and most obviously, we just talked about it, they retain a minimum deterrent. You know, we have to get past this. They want to be recognized as a nuclear weapon state. We won't recognize them. And then they just keep doing what they're doing so that acquiescence, strategic patience becomes a form of acquiescence. And I think we're beyond patience right now. So the urgency is here. But a freeze agreement, which is part of this analytical kind of sweet spot that I've identified of why we might be able to achieve a freeze, this near-term optimization of the parties, there has to be in it something for them, for the North Koreans, and they would retain the deterrent. And there is a downside there. And the second is the moral hazard, that this is an odious regime. And it basically means doing a deal with this regime. And it's we'd have a replay of the JCPOA, you know, that it's a deal, not a grand bargain, that it leaves this odious regime in power, and look what they're doing. And there's a moral hazard attached to that. I'd also, since I'm speaking in one of the crown jewels of the American, nuclear science and tech field, and an institution that with your partner labs and the DOE mothership played such a key role in the JCPOA. And this is another good topic that could be fleshed out here. Is like, what would be the verification and inspection requirements of a kind of a JCPOA type deal with North Korea, where you have many more facilities. Even getting an honest declaration from the North Koreans of what they've got would be tough. National technical means may know where some of these sites are. There's not much in the public domain on kind of a covert existence of a covert uranium enrichment facility, but how you would know where to go and monitor size of, what's the size of their arsenal? How much weapons usable material do they have? What are the production rates of the facilities they have on that? And then, constraining the capability. So it would be, a freeze with North Korea would be the JCPOA on steroids in terms of what the labs would be, your support role. And the other point that I didn't really get into is we're in this post-Libya takedown, Syria takedown. What about security assurances for North Korea? Because there'd have to be, something in it for them. And there would be something in it for them if we did a deal. There would probably be some economic aid and lifting of some sanctions. And this kind of hyperlinks back to my point about the moral hazard of keeping an odious regime in power. But we would also probably offer, since we have an armistice with them, try to not go all the way to a grand bargain, but address the armistice status and try to end the armistice and go to like something that approaches a peace treaty, like end of a formal cessation of hostilities. And that would be wrapped into a kind of a multilateral framework like the six-party talks, that would give it kind of legitimacy. Now that's a type of classic security assurance we could provide. Whether they would buy it, I don't know, given the history. Regime takedown in Libya, regime takedown in Syria, in Iraq, what we're doing vis-a-vis Assad now. But we could offer that as part of the deal. The second security assurance, and it's one that North Koreans have raised with Americans in Track 2 exercises, is could you insulate us from the consequences of greater integration into the international system? If they end their isolated status, because that's been the crux for them, that what we view as our grand strategy when is integration, and when states won't integrate into the system, our default alternative grand strategy is not regime change, it's containment. Regime change a la 2003 was a real deviation from our standard kind of strategic, repertoire. But what we view as an inducement, join the international community, integrate in the global economy, reap the tangible benefits from it, they view as a frontal threat to regime survival because economic integration carries the risk of political contagion and potential threat to the regime survival. So they've talked about, like, can you insulate us from the consequences of this process? And that's a security assurance we neither can nor should offer to North Korea, because this freeze would be out of the classic non-pro game plan, which is buy time, constrain capabilities.